Okay, well, thank you everyone for being here today in the Holochain presentation. This is a beautiful moment to be together and to uh, introduce what Holochain, what MetaCurrency project is doing with the Holochain project. To give a little bit of context, the Holochain project is one of several projects of a whole stack, computing stack called Scepter that you can look at scepter.org. And even though we will be focusing today on Holochain, we will also be mentioning some of the other projects because yeah, they will be relevant to the examples and the setting of the context and moving on diving with Scepter. Scepter is created by the MetaCurrency project, and as many of you know, we develop tools and platforms for open sourcing the next economy. So we work a lot in tools, but we also work in the part of consciousness and developing new maps and models for living systems and deeper understanding of wealth and well-being. So today with us, we'll have presenting Eric Harris Braun and Arthur Brock, and they have been working on this for the past 10 years. So it's a long time, and they have been working together. Eric is our code monkey, as he calls himself, so but he's really, for me, he's going so deep into the living systems principles, into a whole philosophy that really underlies the source, a deeper source on how computing systems are built on. So, and we've been working together for so many years and developing some software together. And Art Brock, I consider him my currency guru. He's been developing literally hundreds of currency systems all around the world. And it's really, really beautiful to have him here and his expertise. And these together are the powerhouse of Scepter and the MetaCurrency project. So it's an honor to have you guys here with us today. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for hosting and setting this up, Fair.
It's my pleasure. You know, I'm super excited to have this meeting today, and to set a little bit of a context, we will be speaking about Holochain and the inspiration behind it briefly, and then why is it important to, in this moment in time, for the creation of new types of social organisms and distributed applications, like kind of our global nervous system. And we will be naming examples on what can be built with Holochain. And then we will also go geeky for those geeks that want to know about the nuts and bolts on how this is created and some distinctions on the blockchain. And please write your questions in the chat. I'm so sorry, this is so noisy. It was so silent and had that lock. Now a whole family is here. I might have to move. So the where I got distracted. Okay, so we will be going geeky. Please put your questions on the chat. Here with me, I have also Robert Best. He's part of the team, of the MetaCurrency team, that will be co-hosting this space with me. So we will be both aware of your questions and to be able to give the space for your contributions. So that is something that we will be able to do as we go. So to start the conversation, and yes, we'll be using on how we can apply Holochain to be able to create different types of applications and we'll go into that as we move on. So first, I want to give the high context that is really important for me, because I am inspired on regenerative economies and I'm inspired on living systems. And we know that there is these different metaphors of mechanistic worldview and a living system worldview. And mechanistic worldview has been really powerful, but it's really has been simplifying the complexity so that it can create different inputs and outputs and see the world as a machine. But when the problem with seeing the world as a machine is that the machines break. Once one thing of the machine breaks, then everything breaks. They don't work. They don't have anti-fragility. Versus living systems, when there is a disruption in the system adapts. And of course, there's much more to say on the metaphor, but I want to give the space for Eric and Art to share what was their inspiration. I know it was drawn from living systems, but I really want to give the space for them to give us a context on why they had to draw into the inspiration of nature to build Scepter.
Okay. Yeah, so the anti-fragility that Fair talked about is part of it, but there's, for us, a kind of whole mind shift that occurs around technology, technical architectures, social architectures, when you start looking at things through the lens of natural systems. And what we want is to be able to have the same kind of composability, evolutionary capabilities as we find in nature, where things can be mashed up and recombined and have a certain type of kind of autonomy and things in the computing space, the way they're structured today, tend to be rather brittle and also tend to take what I think of as an absolutist view on data. So there's like one of the challenges that distributed computing platforms have is they're trying to sort of reach consensus, reach agreement about some absolute state of data, when that isn't really the way the world works. There's, at least as near as we can tell, the general theory of relativity was published 100 years ago in 1917, and it seems to have a lot of truth to it that things are sequenced, or an experience happens from a particular vantage point, not from some absolute sequence of events or absolute vantage point. And so that's really part of how we have built Holochain. And deeper than that, Holochain is a part of the project called Scepter. Scepter is short for receptor. One of the things that we discovered is central to this anti-fragility, to this composability, is the receptive capacity for things to be able to connect to other things on a carrier, but remain open to as of yet unknown compositions, as of not yet unknown things to be said. And that changes the architectures a little bit into forms which for us, we didn't even realize some of the places that would take us, like into self-describing protocols and a whole bunch of other domains. But part of what we were shooting for is to build a system centered on agency rather than some abstraction of truth of a state of data. And then agents basically leave tracks. They are accountable for the changes that they make. And so at any time you can see in the state of a system what has changed according to what agents so far at this time, rather than some absolute perspective. I feel like I hopped around a bunch of different places there, but for us, a lot of these things came out of really looking at the way nature works. Like, the cells in your body, there's no boss cell, but every cell takes a copy of the instructions and then does its thing. The instruction's called DNA, and then does its thing, manages its state. There's not like a global ledger that they all have to manage agreement on all the time. And so it's taken us in directions that are very different than some of the architectures that have shown up like blockchain that are also trying to create decentralized systems. And so Holochain ends up being a strange organic alternative to that. Is there anything you want to say?
I guess maybe I'll go off in a slightly different dimension, because the question you asked, Farah, was about inspirations. And so this, I think Arthur gave a nice feel, an overview of some of the technical inspirations that yield specific technical results. And I would just speak to the sort of the more global inspiration that I have, and I think we share, and probably many of you on this call share as well, which is the desire to find new ways for humans to practice collective intelligence. And we want to do that in sort of like, it feels to me like we've been in about 5,000 or X thousand years of the pyramidal collective intelligence, the hierarchical structures for organizing ourselves, that was the phase in which we could scale out. But nature doesn't actually work that way. It has a ton of distributed systems in which mostly what you have is protocols being spoken by free agents. And that pattern of nature we want to apply to be able to catalyze new forms of collective intelligence for humans that goes beyond pyramidal or hierarchical collective intelligence, so that we can actually enjoy the fruits of scaled out large scale society that doesn't have to scale using hierarchies to do its scaling. So for me, that's a key inspiration in making this happen. And you'll as we talk, we might say things about mutual sovereignty and a bunch of these other patterns that we have in place and unenclosability that are central to the technical architecture to carry out what we want, based on like, how does this actually happen in nature? How does nature scale and solve these problems at a large scale, so that we have ecosystems, anti-fragile ecosystems, rather than hierarchies for scaling?
Yes, thank you. Definitely a place where I'm interested in going. It is so beautiful and so inspiring for me to be, for years in Village Lab. That's an organization I co-founded with Jeff Clearwater, and we were looking for a system like this because we knew that we wanted to build the commons, and that for building the commons, we didn't have the kind of technologies that would get us there, right? And a lot has been circling around, for example, sharing economies, and calling Uber a sharing economy when it's really not around sharing something I have, or gifting something, or access to something I own. So it seems like what we're talking about here is very different. And it will allow for the creation of the commons in a new way. And as you mentioned, Eric, for collective intelligence. So perhaps if we could mention on regards to collective intelligence and new social organisms, what do we call in the Metacurrent Seeker project, what do you call social organisms? And how do Holochain enables new capacities for these social organisms?
So we tend to take we meaning humans, tend to take a rather arrogant view on evolution, where we kind of picture this evolutionary ladder that we're at the top of as, some kind of apex of intelligence or complexity or something like that. And it's like there's a blind spot where we fail to realize that evolution is a function of combining stabilities created at different levels, right? Like subatomic particles into, atoms and molecules into compounds and organic compounds into cells, and cells into multicellular organisms. And we, as humans, are also cells in larger social organisms that we call things like corporations or governments or institutions. And those things we tend to think of through a kind of mechanistic model, or we tend to think that they're sort of the sum of human actions as if it's individual action. that's creating them. But when you look at it, they embody their own patterns of intelligence. They behave differently than individuals, and they have a kind of types of intelligence hard-coded into them or coded into them, and a survival instinct and the ability to spawn off offspring, spin off, other entities, and to continue beyond the individuals that are that participate in them. And so there's a pattern that continues beyond the individuals. And if you look at a lot of the things, a lot of kind of the breakdowns that we're confronting on planetary scale right now, a lot of those are really due to the social organisms we've created, to the way corporations are eating the earth, things like that. And we've created those social organisms as cells. We've been the builders of those patterns. And we have to get really good at building some new patterns of collective intelligence, large-scale coordination and communication. And so most of our tools in the Metacurrency Project, Scepter, Holochain, are all built with this in mind, of becoming the new kind of social DNA that can power these types of organisms on scale that we're a part of.
So what I would add to that is, if you actually think about the layering, the stacks that Arthur's talking about, and you look at the way complex adaptive systems evolve, what we've come to believe and see is that they evolve in the fundamental steps, in the fundamental stages of their evolution. They all happen when a new, shall we call it, expressive capacity, or maybe even a grammatic capacity arrives. So, of course, one of the big interesting ones is DNA. It is a grammar in which you can express a huge range of living systems. And for us, there's I think a core inspiration is to try to bring into being a similar grammatic capacity, an expressive capacity that can represent as powerfully social organization, so that we can do social composability, and so we can build social organisms out of that kind of expressive capacity, from large parts to small parts. So DNA can express for the realm of social organisms. And that's our key goal. And Holochain is one portion of achieving that goal. The larger goal is Scepter, as we talked about.
Thank you, Eric. That's very, very valuable, and I think that one of the aspects we want to reinforce is that aspect of the expressive and receptive capacity and the language and the grammars. And one of the powerful analogies that you have given us in time, or the stories or narrative, Eric, is that of how money is just one instance of an expressive capacity that is in the process of evolving. And I'm going to repeat that because it has profound implications in saying money is just one instance of an expressive capacity that's in the process of evolving. So we were asked by Farid, what is the current economic system that we are trying to solve? And I want to know your perspective, but my own would be that we're not trying to solve, we're trying to create a new. There's things that we are creating that will bring that new expressive capacity where we can find multiple economic spaces where Holochain can provide an answer for, right? So perhaps if we continue into the social organisms and organizations, we can give a little bit more detail on what are the kinds of things that organizations can create. And this might get into that digital corporation where we incorporate a lot of in our social agreements into code, or something else, and what we call the sovereign accountable commons. or something else, and just opening into deepening and deep diving more into what are the economic spaces and the connection with social organisms.
Well, I think maybe one place to go with that, and Arthur, jump in as you like, is to think about the information system that underlies value representation, right? And so I like where you were going with the statement of money as being one form of that that's under evaluation or under evolution. So the question then shows up is what's necessary to be able to represent the full spectrum of what's valuable, rather than simply one of the aspects of what's valuable, which is that which is exchangeable, those parts of the human society that is movable back and forth. Money does a job at that, but most of the value that we are interested in representing lives at a different level, and lots of different levels, and has a much richer grammatics it's necessary to be able to express that. So money, it's as if all we could speak was, pronouns, not even nouns, just one tiny part of the spectrum of value in the language that can express that for us to organize around. And so I think that's one of the places that's key for us is finding that expressibility and finding a whole stack of the composable parts that make it possible to have a large-scale grammar for value.
Yeah, I think one of the other things I would say about that is back to that theme of new expressive capacities or the ability to have the means to represent new things to coordinate around. With the advent of DNA, there was this Cambrian explosion of organisms, many different biological tries at organizing systems, and a bunch of those failed, right? A bunch of those went away, but a bunch of them stuck around. And we see what we current currencies, like you can think of that not as money. We're trying to reclaim the word currency because it comes from the word currents or flows, as sort of currency, the ability to see currents or flows, the symbol systems that we create to collectively manage those, to see those together. That becomes a part of kind of like the nervous system signaling of the social organisms, because the social organisms can't coordinate or respond to things that they can't see, to flows that they don't have a way of encoding the existence of. And as we evolve this new capacity around currencies, and decentralized ones in particular, that give new kinds of power dynamics than exist in the current economy, I think there's going to be a new explosion, an Anthropocene explosion or whatever, of social organisms, new patterns of organizing. And I mean, you can also look at other points in history, like you could say maybe language is one of the things that gave rise to a whole explosion of tribes and cultures, right? Like the ability to share beliefs and perspectives about something gave rise to a whole, fabric of those different tribes and cultures that we still, in many ways, have inherited, the legacy of a lot of those things today. And so we think we're poised on a pretty vital cusp of transition, such that this new economy doesn't look much like the old economy. It's not about distilling things down to one-dimensional quantities used for trade, but about the kind of dimensionality of value that's needed to nourish living systems, more complex systems.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I think that we have been going very, very deep into the part of the living systems and the connections on how we can actually we're in these beautiful, interesting times where we can actually have the ways and the solutions to be able to manage that complexity, but because we can see it, right? We can make it visible, we can see those flows, and we can also shape them, and we can shape some of those behaviors, and that changes the whole game in multiple dimensions. So, many of the people that are present here know about the blockchain, and right now is the place where I'll go a little bit more geeky into saying, okay, we know that the new, this big buzz on the blockchain and how precious it is that evolution gave us that opportunity to see the blockchain just grow and expand so quickly, and the multiple possibilities that it offers. Not only Bitcoin is just one little place of innovation that is enabled by blockchain, but also the part of smart contracts and new ways of using of managing supply chains, and all this variety, incredible, like all the kind of disruptions that are possible through blockchain. So I want to give people a visibility, an opportunity to speak about what is different from the Holochain, from the blockchain.
So I alluded to one important thing earlier about kind of an absolutist view of data, like that there's a single perspective on reality, the global ledger that we all have to agree upon, we have to reach consensus on. That blockchain operates on that architecture. Just a simple thing for those who don't necessarily know the mechanics of it, it's hard to reach agreement between many different systems. Distributed computing is actually kind of hard. And so blockchain came up with a few innovations, like bundling a bunch of changes into blocks of transactions instead of trying to get every transaction synchronized and agreed upon, and the timing and the sequence of it. And then they also kind of added this randomization, a little bit of a timer, sort of approximately 10-minute delay of busy work that it takes you to brute force crack a hash, which also randomizes whose perspective on reality, whose transactions in a block get to be committed to the blockchain. And so it's really easy to think of the history of a blockchain once it's settled as if it was some sort of truth, but really there's kind of a lottery happening to choose whose truth, which miner's truth we're going to accept, and you have to have this little token to prove that you did the work of all the cracking this hash, to have your view in reality be the one that's accepted. And then the other nodes validate that there's no invalid transactions and that type of stuff in it. But it's a lot of work on every cycle to try to validate that perspective on reality. And everybody has to do all the same validation. And then there's all the busy work that you're doing as well, the cracking of the hash, which is computation that basically gets thrown away by everyone. So that's blockchain. What we're doing with Holochain is a fundamentally different architecture. Rather than one chain, one ledger, if you will, every agent, every participant has their own signed chain, and it is assumed that they have the authority or the agency to write to their own chain, to change their own state. And then certain types of changes are also ones that are shared to a shared space using an existing architecture that, a variation on an existing architecture that many of you may be familiar with, a DHT, a distributed hash table. Like BitTorrent, for example, uses a distributed hash table. There's a few things a little bit different about this DHT in that it's a validating DHT. So if I write something to my chain and then share it out to the DHT, before any node can accept it for publication, they have to validate that what I did was we followed the rules of the application that we're participating in at that moment. And otherwise, the data won't propagate in the shared space. And just like with blockchain, if you start committing blocks to your own instance of the blockchain that others wouldn't validate, you're kind of forking yourself off into a different reality that others don't accept. And that's a similar kind of thing that happens in Holochain, except it happens at the level of individual agency. If you hack your node or you start doing things that would let you make changes that others won't validate, you can make those changes to your own state, but they won't be accepted within the DHT. We actually created a little graphic. Are you going to share that?
You want me to bring it up? I can do that.
Yeah. Can we share screen there?
I think I can do it here. Let's see.
We created a little graphic to try to make this possible to picture, or easier to picture. You scroll down just a little so we can see the bottom ones. So, yeah. Okay.
Can people see this? Is it showing up?
Yes.
Okay, great.
So every node in this network, in this DHT, has its own chain. That's these different colored nodes with entries and headers that chain it all together, and they sign all these headers, and then you share the entries out into the shared space. And that DHT, maybe in this illustration, it's as if there's one shared space, but if you have a large application, you're probably sharding that DHT into many different neighborhoods, so that any particular node only has to hold a small fraction of the contents of the shared space. That's a different thing. But maybe we can zoom in on Genesis entries.
Go ahead.
So every chain starts with the same Genesis entries, which the first entry is the DNA, which is basically the hash of the code that you're running in this application. So every Holochain application is a different Holochain. Blockchain we tend to talk about blockchain as if it's one big monolithic thing that we're going to write, that all applications write something to. Holochain, it's different spaces for each application, different DHT and shared space. And every chain starts with basically a hash of the code that it's using, and that is part of how you identify that you're on the same chain. The next entry is your user keys, basically. This starts to individuate you and share your public key out onto the system, which is what's showing here. So it's a very different architecture than Holochain. It's one that, than blockchain. And it's one that is focused on eventual consistency in the DHT rather than constant consensus for every action. The place where you do need consensus for an action is on a very small scale. If you are doing a transaction that affects another party, not just a change to your own state, but something that affects somebody else's state. Say, for example, a monetary transaction. You can think of the way you would use cryptocurrencies in this as double entry accounting. So it leaves my account and enters Eric's account. So we both have to sign the exact same transaction to our chains. So we have to reach consensus about that transaction, but that's just 2 nodes rather than 2 million nodes. And we can be managing this, we can be negotiating this consensus while other people are negotiating other transactions. There's no bottleneck that comes from this. The only bottleneck is I can't be doing 2 exactly simultaneous transactions, right? I have to do them in sequence, but that's a pretty minor bottleneck. I feel like we threw a lot out there. One thing to note on this DHT is, or on this diagram, is in the upper left corner you can see the X'd out star there. That was somebody committed a thing to their local chain that was not valid. They've like hacked their node to be able to do some other type of entry that this application doesn't know anything about. So the other nodes mark that as rejected when they go to validate it. And if this node becomes recognized as somebody that keeps putting bad data out there, they'll blacklist that node and as corrupted or compromised.
I think maybe what I would do is so Arthur went really deep, really fast into the structure of it and how it works, and this crazy picture that is actually quite accurate in describing the difference between the blockchain and holochain. But I want to just step right back out into a more general notion of the thing that we're doing differently is starting from agency, not from data. So blockchain is trying to find consensus around what everybody sees as the same in history, whereas in Holochain what we're doing is we're saying, no, we recognize that you start from the place where every agent will move forward and say things that are real from their vantage point, and then you can have spreading consensus where you can first of all check to see whether what they said matches the rules of the game we're all playing together. That's the first part, the validation part. And then secondly, you can do that consensus between nodes where it's necessary and appropriate. Unlike in the blockchain world, or even in the Ethereum world, where in the blockchain world, the whole world needs to know about whether or not I spent money on a cup of coffee. And that seems kind of insane. That's just not a way of doing a scalable system. And in the Ethereum world, it's almost worse than that because it's every single program counter in the evolution of your machine. The whole world needs to agree on that. And so you don't really have a good, shall we say, fractal model for understanding what's going on. And in Holochain, we wanted to do that in lots of different ways so that and it works when you put agency at the center, because then you have in a sense, the interaction between the individual parties who are interacting to make a transaction happen, and then the interaction of this group that's playing a certain game. And so that's one holochain. And then you have lots of holochains that can run and have a separate layer for composing holochains that's at a completely different level. In the same way that a paragraph is composed at a different level than a syllable or a word is. And this goes back to the expressive capacity side of really trying to design the architecture to match composable abstractions that actually match reality so that we can do currency transactions, like Arthur was talking about, that don't require the whole world to agree that I just bought a cup of coffee.
Sorry, I lost my screen here for the moment. Hello again. Thank you very much. I'm going to track some questions, and there's diversity of many that probably require a little bit of context, and they're like spreading to different directions. So I'm just stay with me, see what we can do. Here. So I'm going to start with the one with Pixel where he says, well, also the bottlenecks on the blockchain seriously limit the potential for mass neural internetworking and scalable, intelligent, automated systems in the network. So how does Holochain move around these limitations?
One of the benefits of being agent-centric and having each agent being able to manage its own state is that you can have individual interactions between endpoints that don't have to be centrally coordinated, and then the effects of those interactions ripple out to basically a shared memory, a shared space of record of those things.
So here's an example. Like the example is that when you're designing Twitter, decentralized Twitter, you can have nodes communicating directly to each other for the direct messaging, and they are truly direct messaging. It doesn't go through any central server, nothing. It doesn't even go to any shared space. And you can also have the validation rules say, oh, nobody can post to my tweet because that gets validated in a decentralized space, and that part moves into the centralized space where there is more agreement that ends up happening in the shared spaces. Maybe you can think of some other examples about like how that works out. And you can do that directly in Holochain.
Yeah, I mean, part of how I think of it is it's like in the real world. Like if you're playing, I don't know, a sport, basketball, and you take steps with the ball without dribbling, right? You had the agency to do that, but then the referee may call you for traveling and say that was an invalid move, take the ball away, turn it over to the other team, and right? But you still have the agency to do things, including potentially make mistakes, although we try to, as much as possible, weed that out, because you run the validation rules on your local commit before it commits. But if you have changed something locally and tried to cheat, we can't prevent people from trying to cheat, but we can make the rest of the system have a kind of immune system against that, just like our bodies do, right? When cells go bad, they become cancerous or other types of things, right? The cell has that autonomy to do that, but then the body protects itself or tries to protect itself.
But what's also fun about this kind of architecture is that if you're agent-centric, and then a group of people say that, you know what, actually basketball would be more fun if you got to take 3 steps. Let's add that to the rules. It's like a composable part that can be played and added into it. So that's another aspect of trying to build for evolution, because there's a natural pattern for forking, for moving to a game in which you've changed that rule slightly and you start playing that game a new way. And that
would be a new Holochain application, forking off with from the history of this one.
But the design is such that that's the kind of thing that we anticipate happening. It's not something we're trying to prevent. We're trying to allow for that kind of evolution in the context of playing the game one way for now, then being able to step into playing a game another way later.
Does that answer your question, Pixel? You're muted, but thumbs up. All right.
Okay. Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you, guys. My name's Ryan, by the way. I think
hey, Ryan.
Pixel, so that's why it says that.
Okay.
Happy to be here. It's excellent.
Cool.
So yeah, that answered my question.
Okay, so thank you. I'm gonna try to navigate the questions the best way possible. And so we're speaking about metaphors, right, as well with living systems, and we're using the concepts of cells. And we know that cells have membranes, not boundaries, that help them keep their own integrity as a sovereign cell, but also helps them deal with their environment and to be able to then metabolize its environment. And so Mark is asking us if he's interested in cellular membrane concept and the issues of omnipresent surveillance, privacy, and user-controlled sharing.
So there's a whole bunch of things bundled in there.
Yes, that's great.
A few things to note. There's no such thing as a public holochain. Each holochain basically has its own membrane around it, and you can control who has access to participating in that membrane a few different ways. One is by controlling who gets a copy of the DNA, who gets a copy of the code, because they can't run a node on that holochain without the correct DNA to run a node. We haven't implemented the end-to-end encryption yet, but the intention is that the whole system is encrypted. We can't do anything about NSA quantum computing breaking all forms of current known encryption, but what we can do is at least use known methods of encryption to make it also a private space. Not only can you not participate without the DNA, but you can not even surveil. You can't see what's happening. You can't read the traffic or anything like that without being a valid participant. Then there's another layer behind that of if somebody, for some reason, if the code is downloadable or somebody shares or leaks the code, and so people could start installing it and trying to become nodes, depending on the way the application was coded, it may require tokens or certain kinds of keys to be able to even join, to be able to speak yourself into the system as a node that others will recognize. You may have to be on a list of authorized tokens. So for example, if one of the things that we're distributing with Holochain just as a sample app is kind of a distributed chat, kind of like a distributed Slack, right? Well, you may want that Slack channel to be, or that Slack team to be a closed space where somebody has to have particular capabilities tokens to be able to join and participate. And so even if somebody got a hold of the code, which isn't hard to get a hold of because it's included in the Holochain as a sample app, but yours would be have a slightly different UUID that does make it unique. If for some reason they found out your UUID and wanted to kind of tune into your Slack group, if they didn't have one of the tokens that would let them join, they would basically bounce right off.
So there's a bunch of other levels too. I mean, for one, I think we skipped this part to the start, which is why Holochain. When you're getting to that, you're talking about collective intelligence. Well, the biggest thing is decentralization, right? If it's truly decentralized, and you're not actually fake decentralized because you require all the miners who then become the centralized entity. But if it's really decentralized, which is what our goal is, that actually begins to solve some of the privacy and security issues just in and of itself in the decentralization. Another detail that Arthur didn't mention is that part of what we're building into Holochain is the ability to encrypt certain portions of the entries that are added to the chain using a technique called Merkle proofs to be able to
not encrypt them, but to
they don't even get shared.
Hide them.
Yeah, they're
to do partial sharing.
Right. So it's possible that what's shared in the shared space is the fact that you did something, not the content of what you did. And the validation rules would make that work well. So, like for example, in a mutual credit currency, you may want to have a description field, and that description field can be shared that you had one, but not its contents, and they always remain in your own private space. So there's a bunch of different things that we're doing to address the concern you're talking about.
Or even in the currency example, you may actually have a field for digital payload where you're actually transferring some token or software or something like that, and you want to keep that private on chains, on local source chains, not in the DHT space ever, for some point later in time in the future for this cryptographic algorithm to be compromised, which can happen on blockchain if you share everything publicly, but you just encrypt it. Right? So anyway, there's a whole bunch of layers of membranes that we work with in Holochain that you get to choose what you're sharing, what you're exposing, who's allowed to play at the table.
And just the fact also that each application is one Holochain and it's a separate Holochain is like just the beginning start. That's a huge start. Right? That makes a big difference right there.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. And there's some questions that even though they have been partially answered in the chat, I want to be present in the video as well. And so there is a questions about how does the transactional space deal with the cheaters? My super good English. Who mediates? Who judges? And how does an agent get related to?
It's a good question.
So there's parts of that going to be built into Holochain in terms of detection, but then in terms of the triggers for blacklisting, for sort of triggering an immune system response, that's really going to be something that you set on a per application basis. You may be really strict about it. You may be a little loose about it, depending on your application. But in any case, the way the architecture of that works, if you have a sharded DHT, let's say let's say we have an application like we're making a distributed Wikipedia, and everybody in total needs to host a handful of pages in order to have thousands of duplicate copies online at all times. You don't have to host all of Wikipedia, right? But if there's a node that is sabotaging data in some way, or corrupting data that's out there, or ascribing authorship of something to somebody else, or different things like that, which would break the validation rules of the application. It's actually up to the other nodes in that node's neighborhood to identify this in their gossip protocols where we're synchronizing, and to basically blacklist them from gossip. And once you blacklist them from gossip in your neighborhood, they're essentially cut off from the shared space, because people can't reach to them, and their messages can't relay out to others, and they become.
And this actually points
isolated.
to something we didn't emphasize at the beginning, which is also a distinction from blockchain, which is that we're not about anonymity. Like, in fact, actually, provenance is one of the key things, which is why you saw in the diagram that the second item of all chains is a public identifier, a public key identifier, and that itself also may have different rules in your application about how you associate that key with your node, right? So this may actually be, you also have to put in there something from a certifying organization about your identity, because this is not a place where you start with identity. With anonymity. If anonymity is needed, our stance is that what you do is you create anonymity through anonymizers. That it's hard to do provenance and social coherence if you don't start with it, and it's easier to achieve anonymity on top of that. That's the stance that we come from in this world.
You put a Tor-like layer inside your application that allows you to anonymize and break up information. It's easier to strip identity than it is to create it once you've not had any kind of foundation for it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there's some questions as well around the governance, and I want to then just like make the context that I want to step back, just answer those questions around governance, like who creates them and how it's governed, and then go into applications. So we want to give a little bit more space of who hosts, supports, and owns the DHT or the multiple DHTs. That's one of the questions that I think that open up a whole governance topic. And then we can go into applications and different currencies and some questions that have been going around that. Thank you.
So I think the easiest answer to the governance one is that that's one of the key points of designing it the way we have, is that every application is governed by the people who are running that application. And so there is no monolithic holochain network like there is for blockchain or for Ethereum. What there would be is the group of people who are playing a particular game, running a particular application, and then the governance is encoded in the rules of that game. So we're not making any large-scale claims on that. You may be asking the question about who runs the governance of the Holochain protocols, and that's a different level of question. I'm not sure if that's where that was going.
I'm not sure, but it's a great question.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Before we go to that one, I want to update, install the updated software and basically put a pointer on their old chain saying, I've moved to here, and have a starting entry after the two Genesis blocks that basically says, I moved from here, to be able to create sort of continuity between those versions. So you can actually you can actually create that kind of virtual continuity between systems, but you can't, because everybody has that local autonomy, they control their local chain, you can't force anyone to do that. And you could have groups that say, we want to fork off in this direction according to these rules, and other groups that say we want to fork off in these directions, that, according to these rules. But you'd have to pick which rules you're forking toward to put that entry on, that sort of closing entry on your prior chain that takes you over to the to the new one.
I guess the point here is, you could say that that's the same for Ethereum, but the difference is that there's not a running platform that you have to be going with all the time, which there is in Ethereum. Each one is localized to its own application, and that's the difference. So there's a big difference between that kind of switching in the Holochain case than in the case like Ethereum, because, yeah.
So that's my perfect entry, because you said the magic word that I was going through after, which is Ethereum. And so we have a question on creative cryptocurrency. And we know that a lot of people that are creative cryptocurrencies are really looking into Ethereum as a way in which to host this and create that as a foundation for them. So there's a question about why would I do with it Holochain? And if I would, where do I start?
Well, at this stage in our development, we would not suggest you implement a cryptocurrency. We are just starting our next set of milestones around security and cryptography, which we actually we jumped in to basically enable people to build applications before we fully stabilized all of the security and cryptography. And so we would suggest that you not really use an application until the security is flat, for starters. So we're another month or two from that being ready. So I just want to give that disclaimer. And then if you...
But answer the why question.
Yeah, the why. Yeah. We actually have in our wiki on the Holochain repository in GitHub, we have a section about why would you use it, or what things should you use this for, and what things shouldn't you use it for. So one of the things you should not use Holochain for is a data-centric or absolutist view cryptocurrency. In other words, where you're trying to determine whether a unit of currency exists or not. And most cryptocurrencies out there are token-centric in this way. And they're trying to determine, does this token exist? Has it been spent? Like the whole double spending problem is a function of, has this token already been spent? We need to know the state of every token. And again, I just want to underscore, the body doesn't have a central ledger for the state of the cells. The universe, as near as we can tell, doesn't have a central ledger for the state of the atoms. And to me, we used a comic in one of our articles about this, but it's sort of as crazy for Eric and I to do a transaction that we need everybody else's consensus means we don't hold our own state. It means the idea of state is somehow some absolute thing out there. Does this token exist? Has it been spent? But when you're agent-centric, it's just like double entry accounting, where I have an account, he has an account, we're making a transaction that changes our two accounts. And nothing else is actually relevant to that transaction if it's not a party to that transaction. And so we don't need that consensus, but that means it's a very different type of accounting than is done in typical cryptocurrencies today, which are token-centric, trying to manage a ledger of what tokens exist, as opposed to I'm managing the ledger of my state, he's managing the ledger of his state, and any changes to our state are being validated in the shared space to be able to be acknowledged. And when we do a transaction, I audit. My application audits his state, makes sure he's in a valid place to do this with me. He audits mine. And we don't do the transaction if we're not in a valid state. And if we hack our nodes or something like that to allow us to do a transaction that would put one of us in an invalid state, then we're again forking our reality off for the rest of the network. The rest of the network will not acknowledge that, right? So
to step back and sum that up, I think the point is, if you want to do currencies, which we think you should do, we'll be very clear about that. We definitely think you should do currencies. You just shouldn't do token-based, data-centric currencies. And we have an article that's on the Scepter website. If you look under Holochain, there's one that
White paper.
a white paper that describes how to think about doing cryptocurrencies from a mutual credit perspective, which is an agent-centric perspective. And I think what you'll find is that it's actually much, much more powerful and leads to much more scalable solutions. Because this is, after all, why we did this project, to be able to do currencies in a scalable way for the world.
Yes,
Just
thank
not
you. And this is
monetary, data-centric currencies.
Right. Also reputation currencies and, like all those types of things. But a reputation currency exists, like you get your college degree signed by that college, right? They're the agent that is issuing this, and it becomes something ascribed to you, ascribed to your record, right? But it's all agent-centric in Holochain.
And just one tiny little bit further on that, which is that the immediate questions that come up are, well, how do you know that you're actually not going over your credit limits? Well, you do that agent-centric as well. You end up having auditors in the ecosystem of the people who are playing, and you add into the rules of the game, you need n random number of players checking to make sure that you're not overspending. And so it ends up being naturally extended into the particular game, the particular currency game you're playing, by virtue of what's necessary for that game.
This is a perfect opportunity to share that we're really working into a cryptocurrency webinar series, actually a deep wealth webinar series with 3 different parts, and one will be focused on the social architects, those of us that really care about new types of organizations and then want to apply all the part of how do we manage the flows within an organization, how do we make it visible, how do we track our contributions, how do we do decision making, while other webinar, the first one of the kind is going to be centered around cryptocurrencies, where we're going to really go very deep diving into what are the cycles of a currency, and it's a lot of good work with beautiful questions that will enable people to really think forward into good cryptocurrency design that is, it's not about the token. It's also about the social physics and what do you want to create, because people need to be very careful that, tend to think about, because we can do cryptocurrencies, let's do them, but you actually have to ask yourself, what is the social physics? What is the kind of social outcome that I want? Because it becomes the DNA of any organization. So if you think about money and its design, many of the social outcomes that we see that we put on humans, like greed and scarcity, and it's actually part of the design of the currency. So how do we design for a different outcome? And as I constantly remind ourselves, is like the outcome of harmony, the outcome of building together the commons. So this is the bridge towards what other kinds of applications are possible. If we were to examples, what is being built right now? I know we did have a first hackathon in San Francisco, and there was a very interesting group of geeks, and perhaps we can give some examples of what are they working on, or what kinds of applications are people dreaming about.
Are you asking Eric and I, or do you want examples from others about?
I'm asking Eric and Art.
Okay. One of the things that I'm excited about doing in maybe, 6 months or so, I'm a little afraid to talk about the timelines, is launching a distributed application hosting ecosystem powered by Holochain with a hosting currency that's figured into the mix that, it's kind of like you earn Bitcoin by mining, by doing this stupid computation that you throw away. Well, in this case, you would earn currency by sharing capacity, sharing some processing power, storage, or bandwidth, and that starts building an infrastructure for a whole distributed application hosting framework. And we would like to launch that distributed framework along with some new types of commons, new actual sharing economy type things, like an Uber without the company in the middle, or a Airbnb, or peer generated electricity, and kilowatt credits, and things like that, where the currencies start becoming a way to capitalize the ecosystem and also become basically pre-purchase credits for being able to use services from that ecosystem, so that we can actually be building peer-to-peer economy on an architecture that's completely decentralized. That as long as any players want to play, nobody else can actually shut them down. As long as two people want to play, they can be playing, you know.
So thank you. So I've heard that people are already looking on how to build the Uber without the middleman or the Airbnb with blockchain. So if you would tell people, hey, be aware of this and that, what would be that this and that? You know, what would be, why would I wait for Holochain, or why should I shift from a technology that already has so much momentum into a new technology? What are the opportunities and distinctions?
There's a few things that to me kind of differentiate it. One of the things has to do, again, with, for example, the example of the Ethereum hard fork, right? That there's a group of people that can basically pull the rug out from under the infrastructure. You know, it's a little bit crazy if you think about the Ethereum hard fork as it's kind of like the DAO hub. If you think about the DAO hub as like a website on the internet, you know, and there was a bug in their website, and so we changed the internet. You know, like that's crazy to like change the underlying protocols of a system because of a bug in an application. Because Holochain applications actually are independent of each other. They each run in their own space, their own DHT, and because Holochain's open source, even if we start developing Holochain in a direction you don't want to go, you can run the version that you started on, and you are running in your own space. Nobody can shut that space down. Nobody can force it to fork. Nobody can enact that type of thing. Again, as long as there are people that want to play, they can.
So, and specifically about Ethereum, I mean, I don't have a lot of experience building an Ethereum apps, but at our hackathon, we had one of the participants talked about the real downside of the security of running on Ethereum. Because there, your application, you have to pay for every cycle that it runs, right? There's an actual cost in ETH to that. And if you have a bug in your code, the consequences are exceptionally high. And it's sort of global. It's built into the system. It's not a localized problem. And I think that there is an architecture difference there where there's and this is part of the anti-fragility, right? If you make a mistake, it's not nearly as dangerous in the Holochain world as in the Ethereum world, from what I can tell and what I was told by this developer who spent, I don't know, what he said, the last 3 months, it was terrifying for 200 lines of code.
Right, so they built their smart contract, but they've been afraid to release it. And so they keep doing security audits and all that kind of stuff, because once it's in the wild, it's written in stone and there's actual financial costs to it. And one of the things he liked was the possibility of doing an invitation-only Holochain, where you could invite people in that you are friendly with, and you can run it for a while. You can even set a time clock on it. This deactivates in 2 months. This is a 60-day, trial of this system, at which point we're going to have to fork to a new chain because this one shuts down, and the idea that you could actually run those things, not just on a fake test network, because Ethereum does have a test network, but actually in a live test network with people that you've invited, and then you could basically control your risk of being able to launch these things. That was another big thing.
Thank you, Arthur. So now, and Eric, so now I want to go into that also a little bit deeper into the distinctions. And you mentioned that Holochain with the distributed application environment is something that really excites you. And that brings us and bridge perfectly into what people are also super excited about on decentralized autonomous organizations. So if we can explain a little of what that is, and then what is the difference with sovereign accountable commons, which is the type of organizations that we are birthing with Holochain and decentralized applications.
So where smart contracts tend to put an emphasis on stability or solidity or rigidity, right? Like that you can set your set of agreements and that code now becomes law and you are subject to those agreements. They are immutable. They are coded into something forever. We are trying to build patterns instead of the DAO, a sort of decentralized autonomous organization. We're in the Scepter world. We're calling our parallel structure to that a sovereign accountable commons. So it's sovereign again in the sense that nobody can shut it down. Nobody can force a fork. Nobody can force a change on it. And there's mutual sovereignty between the individuals. Each individual maintains their agency to make changes to their state. But when it comes into the group space, the shared space, it has to be validated by the group. The only things that will validate are things that are playing by our shared rules. So there's a mutual sovereignty there. There's also accountability. You have a signed history of your actions. Anything you try to share out into the shared space is signed, published by you. And I wanted to touch, actually, Eric mentioned earlier, we're not starting from anonymity, but that doesn't mean for any particular application that you don't have at least pseudo-anonymity or something like that. That depends on what the requirements are in that application space. And then the commons is the fact that it is being published to a DHT, to a shared space, but you never lose anything that you share. You know, one of the interesting things about our politics is that it tends to polarize around the power of the group or the power of the individual, right? Like, does the group get to force you to pay taxes or to, you know, drive on the right side of the road or to whatever, or does the individual get to have their own freedom? And, you know, like there's a lot of kind of political polarizing around this. And we're basically saying that part of the power of Holochain is the embodiment of both, that you still maintain your individual autonomy, but only things that are in accord with the group's rules replicate into the shared space, ripple into the shared space. So you have a lot of interesting composability that happens there. Go ahead. I was about to cross over into another space,
I think the one, so Arthur stayed technical in that description of the sovereign accountable commons, but I wanted to add just a few things in as well, that in the world, because this touches back on the person who said, what about the governance model? So in the world of sovereign accountable commons, we also are trying to embody how that actually hooks into the current world and have an interface between the current world and this new form, which is really commons scaled up. So part of what we're concerned about creating, and then this is the motivation for why Holochain and Scepter in the first place, is to be able to create accounting forms that allow us to contribute value into the commons and account for it. So that it's not about ownership as much as it is about understanding what the social contract is for playing in the commons, because that's how you can scale commons to a large scale. Commons works very well at the small scale because in original collective intelligence formats, people can see what the social contract is, and they can weed out people who are not playing by the social contract. So you can have a commons without tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons happens when we don't have a social contract to play with. So
and we make it public. We strip away all the membranes.
Right. So it's this intermediate space that requires value accounting that's not monetary, and has this mutual sovereignty component that Arthur is talking about that's necessary. So, for example, one of the ways that we're creating in the sovereign accountable commons in the current world, the ability to contribute into the commons is by creating what we're calling a human commons license. It's a version of some of the open source licenses in which humans have the right to use the contributions in the commons for free, but corporations have to have a commercial license to have that use. And so that may be free or may not be free, but it distinguishes between the, right now, which is a veiled place between collectives and humans. And I think this is a tool that will actually allow us to have contributions into the common space where corporations don't just reap the benefits of individuals' contribution to commons-based software.
Just to take that a little bit further with the human commons license, if a corporation, wants to have all their employees use it as humans, use the software as humans, then those humans maintain their agency. They own their identity, their work, their records. They take it with them. If the corporation wants to own that that human's agency, that's where you have to use the corporate license. That's where you've taken away agency from the person, basically.
So this is just an example. You're asking about what's going on with how we're looking at the digital accountable, or the digital autonomous organizations. So we have sort of a hybrid there where we're saying, okay, it's really important to have the map part, the value accounting part, to make that work. But it's not only in the digital realm. Sorry, this thing is making noise at me. Is that you or me? You.
Yours off.
I got it. Sorry about that.
So let's go into a wider vision then. I know that, Arthur, you were very interested and you started actually this website called artofgovernance.org or artofgov.org. And there was this post about giving a vision of what our governance can be. And you even called it governance, not governments. And then you started to set up some of the principles or some of the visions on how we can think about that. Right? Like we are in such a big transition, and that big transition is very difficult to think out from the shore of the new world, right? It's like we're building all these bridges in between the new and the old, and we're in between stories, and we're both pushed by the old and pulled by the new. But you guys are working so much in that part of the new, and I want to presence that of the governance in the big, wide aspect and possibility of that. Can you talk more on that, Art?
Go for it.
Well, let me actually bring it down from the larger scope to one of the things we would like to do with Scepter and the tools that we build is to turn the licensing, management, and revenues of the software over to a sovereign accountable commons that has a loose interface or potentially a tight interface, but has an interface with a legal entity as well that can actually open bank accounts and be able to
live in the current world.
Live in the current world, but that basically we want to turn a lot of this over to a self-governing commons and have a lot of sophistication in the feedback loops there about, people's voice actually being weighted based on their sort of stakeholderness contribution to the ecosystem, not necessarily a complete linear weighting, but having an amplification for people that actually have skin in the game, and being able to divvy up feedback and decisions to different people based on their interests and passions, and have that filter and bubble up solutions, toward more general consideration. And so you can kind of think of that in the way that you customize your social network feeds to your interests and, like that type of thing. Your participation in the governance would also be tuned to your interests and gifts and talents and knowledge and expertise. And it's hard to talk about this not in sort of general sweeping terms at the moment through metaphor, because I'm not sure that we have a lot of experience with doing this directly. I think one of the problems is that we overrate the decision-making portion of governance. It's kind of like being big-brained critters. We like to think that our rational, logical part of our brain is the part that matters. We make that same mistake projected onto social organisms, as if it's about the executive function or management that it's the primary thing, when most of what's going on all the time is that we need to have really tuned and healthy feedback loops going on. So we don't have to think about each step that we're taking, each breath that we're making, the system becomes very self-governing. And for me, part of the fun is figuring out those patterns and feedback loops for building a healthy ecosystem. And then there's a small portion of it that goes into the decision-making space.
Just a tiny comment on that motivates why Holochain and why Scepter. Because if you want to do that, you need to have a stack of composable abstractions that allows for composability, so that can be done at all levels. You can't, because then the decisions can get embodied at the right level. So the breathing and the walking and the heartbeat, those are low-level decisions, and they have to be made not by the conscious mind. Or when they are, it's for really good purposes, like holding your breath underwater, or running into a fire to save a kid. But then if you have a stack of composable abstractions, then you can have really powerful, healthy systems. And that's why Holochain, right? So this Holochain lives at the very low level in the stack. It's kind of like almost the phone names of the expressive capacity that allows you to build up to the place where you can talk about the generalities that Arthur was getting at, that kinds of feedback loops that can embody the values, otherwise known as the flows that make social organisms healthy.
Woohoo! I love that. It just reminds me why I'm with you guys. So this is, I would like to start wrapping up, and I would want to invite even though I have invited people to share their conversations via chat, their questions via chat, but I want to open up the microphone and invite people to just share their questions. Anything that you want presents, this is the right moment. After I just ask this next question on what is next for Holochain, and yes, just what is next for Holochain, and then open the floor. Thank you.
Well, there's a lot of development that needs to be done. That's the main thing. We're moving through a bunch of milestones. Arthur mentioned one of the things that's next, which is the cryptography and security stage. We want to build out a lot of sample apps. We have some that are there, partially built, like a distributed Twitter, distributed Slack. We want to make those actually be rather solid and start using them ourselves. So that's one of the sets of steps that are next. We also have Judd is on the call here, having some ecosystem for actually hosting apps, so that we can provide in the meantime hosting for people who want to run hosting, because they're not going to do it on their local machines. We want to set that up and also have a network of distributed spaces for hosting. So there's a bunch of other steps. Do you have some other ones you want to mention?
Well, Eric was talking about the stack of composable abstractions with holochains, and holochains that can interface and interact with other holochains. So one of the things that we need to build soon is the holochain of holochains, which is essentially a distributed distribution mechanism for holochain DNA. So you don't have to go to a centralized website. There's no centralized website that could be shut down. And
kind of like GitHub for Holochain, in the sense that that's where all the code is stored, right?
Except that GitHub is a centralized website, but Holochain would be stored on a holochain among anybody who wants to help host the holochain of holochains. Right. Well, a couple things that would also entail in the holochain of holochains is not only distribution of the code or DNA for each holochain app, but also the pointing to bootstrap servers or gateway servers. If you want to be able to have publicly queryable data from a holochain, you can find the gateways that you could actually query that data from if you're not a member. And then another thing would be distributed public key infrastructure. One of the things that we think a lot of holochains are going to want to do is, we talked about this thing of tokens, being available. Well, if I can make sure that you are who you say you are through some distributed public key infrastructure, I can authorize that user on that infrastructure with a token. And then if you can prove to me that you're that user, then you're in, right? And we think that a lot of holochains are going to want to be able to use this kind of thing. Plus, we kind of don't, we need this in the world, right?
Right. So like in that case, if we have a distributed public key infrastructure, that can be used to make it so that you can sign into other websites without having it be through Google for your OAuth sign in via Google. It could be through a distributed system so that Google and Facebook aren't watching all of your sign-ins.
Right. So those are some of the systems that we're making as building blocks even for other holochains to be able to use.
And perhaps, Art, you can share on what is going to be the development that would lead to fuel. And
Right. So then one of the things that we want to create is the management system for this distributed hosting architecture with a two-part currency system, one being a reputation-based system that you can kind of think of it like your sharing ratio, your BitTorrent sharing ratio, and the other being a cryptocurrency that if you don't have reputation or you want to operate anonymously, you may need to pay for your traffic to be hosted or move on that system. We want to enable that whole infrastructure powered by a cryptocurrency that will also do some of the capitalization for the next stages of development. So, similar to how Ethereum did its Ether fundraising, we would be doing a fuel kind of currency fundraising for the next stages of Scepter development on top of Holochain.
Thank you very much. So that's for the Holochain development, and we're also going to have a hackathon in August when Arthur will be here around Ashland. So just stay tuned on what we will be announcing that very, very soon. So this is the moment where I open and share the floor with you guys, and there's no bad questions. All questions really matter. If you have a question, it's probably that somebody else also has it. And I did promise in Twitter and other social media that we can get these guys in trouble. So just throw your questions, give it to us, and this is the moment. Just turn on your microphone and ask. Wow, it's also crystal clear that nobody has a good question to throw into the center. Okay.
Wait,
Well,
somebody's
got one,
speaking.
somebody.
Okay, let's go. I can't hear anything. Who is speaking?
Ryan is speaking. I can hear him.
You can? Okay.
Yeah.
You can repeat the question in case somebody else can't hear it as well.
Okay. Yeah. So So Ryan's asking about, could you hear Ryan Fair?
I can't, no, and maybe other people can, so if you can just like...
Some people are hearing it. So he's asking about Holochain being extended to more sophisticated data types and things like in virtual reality spaces.
Also large-scale data.
Large-scale. I want to kind of beg off on the issue of real-time functionality at the moment until we've really had a chance to run our gossip protocols and everything through the ringers to see what kind of delays there are, because we're operating from an eventual consistency model. The data will catch up, but not that you will necessarily have all of the exact consistent data right now. And so I just want to give that disclaimer about VR. And then I feel like you're wanting to...
Well, I think the thing is, so given that disclaimer, there are a bunch of very, very interesting places that you can go with the approach that we're at. And I think that's what you're feeling here. Because I think we can do some very interesting things about content delivery, where we move large-scale content to places that are closer where they're needed. And I think that we've been talking about content delivery networks and managing that with a Holochain, which is not having the data itself, but having the currency systems that evaluate where stuff needs to go. So there's some possibilities in that space. And then also, it really depends a lot on what you're doing inside that space. So you might not be able to manage the shared space of my hand showing up exactly the same place as your hand shows up inside of a Holochain app. That you may have to have a shared server that uses sort of more traditional protocols for managing consensus about that shared vision in the physical space. But in terms of all of the types of stuff you want to do inside a virtual reality space, that's just an application, right? And so you run that as your, like, I don't know, I mean, if your game is real time and you're trying to track bullets flying across space, not so good. But if your virtual reality space is about doing decision making and having social interaction in a space, I don't see it all. It seems to me like it's a very close relationship.
Yeah, one of the things we haven't talked about is that the UI is very loosely coupled to the Holochain data integrity engine, right? So you could have different types of UIs, some of which could be more VR, sophisticated. In fact, one of the things that you can do is have UIs that cross over between holochains. You know, like one of the dangers in the traditional security world is this whole kind of cross-site scripting type of thing you try to protect from on servers across domains and such. But one of the things that Holochain does is package agency in a way that you can do some safe cross-site scripting. Meaning, if I, on my machine, I'm running multiple holochains, I have agency on each of those chains. And if one of my chains wants to, basically make a change on another change, we want to mash together a UI that allows me to do interactions across multiple chains. In each of those spaces, it's operating under my agency, and we can actually mash up some of those configurations for interesting crossovers. And so anyway, the point being that the UI is very loosely coupled from the data engine underneath, so that you could have very interesting UIs layering on top of sophisticated data.
And and just in terms of your question about getting more information, join the Slack channel or look at the website at scepter.org, click on projects and Holochain, and we can connect you in with whatever level you want to play. I mean, in terms of development, it's growing, our community is growing, and we want it to grow even more quickly, so welcome on board if that's where you want to go.
Thank you. So we have other questions. And that's from Doug, and he asks, how does Holochain deal with the nexus with non-peer-to-peer blockchain cultures and further with analog industrial area structures and practices? And how does it facilitate migration from there to here?
Could you read the question one more time, please?
Yes. How does Holochain deal with the nexus with non-peer-to-peer blockchain cultures and further with analog industrial area structures and practices? How does it facilitate migration from here to there?
I think that's a really good question and an interesting one. I feel like one of our basic approaches, that there's no such thing as a public holochain, is kind of the answer to that. Right? Because if you actually want to, you could run every single node of the holochain on one network, and you could really control it quite centrally. And then you could start breaking out that agency of the different nodes as you're comfortable doing so. Whereas you can't do that in, well, I mean, I guess you sort of can do that in the blockchain world, and that's why all the banks are like doing that kind of thing. But I think there's a kind of naturalness to the architecture that it can play as decentralized as you want it to or not in that way. That's one answer. What might you think about, Arthur, in that realm?
Well, the question evokes something else for me, which I'm not sure is really being asked, but about our intentions for Holochain and Scepter as transitional tools from industrial era economies, industrial age economies, to information age economies, which I think of actually as post-monetary economies. This whole thing of a single linear, monetary system that we're trying to reduce everything to is very erosive to the patterns of healthy community and healthy living systems that we actually need to sustain. And so for me, the dimensionality, the richness of dimensionality that becomes possible, like when I say that this distributed application hosting system that we're launching is bimodal. It can run in reputation currencies or in a monetary currency, a cryptocurrency kind of thing. That's on purpose. That is because we see tapping into some of the monetary currency of the industrial age, economies to fuel the transition toward something which in the long run is going to be running on the reputation currencies. And so the fact that we're building those things in from the outset is to be able to make this a transitional currency. And I think that our intention is to fuel many of those types of things, where we can be building new commons with new value accounting in many different currencies that do not just reduce to dollars or Bitcoin or something.
And so also, the question where Farah asked about the strategy for going forward, and we mentioned things like identity services and DPKI. Our intention is to actually spin that kind of thing off as an actual for-profit or connected to a sovereign accountable commons, because there's value for that kind of service in the current world. People at enterprise want that. They need it. But its value, if we can also attach it to a sovereign accountable commons, can be moved into the commons. Right? So
it could start in a corporation providing commercial services, but its legacy be carried forward by a digital commons that can't be shut down.
So I think one of our overall intentions in structure is figuring out and actually embodying, like Arthur described, modes of pushing assets and value into the commons and expanding that common space. And I think Holochain is set up, because of the things we've been talking about, because of the composable abstractions, because of the social architectures that we're holding for this becoming, is poised to do that well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we have a couple of questions more. Let me see. Let me track this a little further. So this is, how does the Holochain, no, that's the same question. Could you graft the Holochain functionality and layer on top of a traditional enterprise infrastructure? that would effectively innervate or enact an agency awareness layer within a larger traditional corporation?
You could certainly do some conceptual mapping. One of the challenges, I think, in the actual translation between those two contexts is that the reason we call Holochain a data integrity engine, or distributed data integrity engine, is that in the past we've conflated the access to data and the ability to change it with data integrity. And when you move things into a distributed context, you no longer can control the access or even the ability to change some data, right? Like I may be holding a chunk of data that I want to then change or manipulate, right? But if I do that in a DHT, I break the hash. It no longer is being pointed to. It's not going to be retrieved in the same spot anymore. So me tampering with the data basically makes it not be findable by how you were intending to retrieve that data in the first place. And if I try to make a change on my state, on my local chain, that is not in accord with our shared sort of validation rules, it won't ripple out into shared spaces. And that's not how we think about corporate security at the moment. We think about corporate security in these sort of layers of castle walls, these, who is allowed to pass through in which ways and change which things. And we don't have them abstracted in a completely peer-to-peer way such that the same validation rules run at every node. So we're policing each other as completely mutual peers. So when you change an architecture, when you translate between centralized and fully distributed, there's no special elevated permissions that any node has. Every node is running the exact same validation rules. And you have to think about that when you build your application. And so I think
that doesn't translate to the fact that every node can do all the same things, because your validation rules can create classes of nodes and all the rest. But the DNA is everywhere.
Right, and every node will validate that you were of that class to make that change.
Right.
Or, right, like if you made this distributed Slack team, maybe there starts out being an administrator, and an administrator can appoint other administrators or whatever. And administrators can delete, spurious posts, but normal people can't delete other people's posts. And, so there's validation rules that every node is going to run, that you were an administrator, or that you, in order to accept your deletion.
But I think going back to the question was, can you run this in an enterprise environment? Well, the answer is sure, because you can create your own application, run it in an enterprise environment, and then maybe that application will see this way of thinking. You can do that, but it's not
they don't map exactly to each other. They're different mindsets.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They can be translated usually. Like so far, I haven't confronted a centralized problem that we can't fulfill the same intent with this distributed solution, right? Like a cryptocurrency that with basically one ledger, it's many copies of that ledger, but a single ledger that determines whether the tokens exist. Well, the intent there is about being able to facilitate transactions and trade and that kind of stuff. You can do that with the double entry accounting through mutual credit. You can fulfill that intent with a different architecture, but it requires thinking about the architecture differently.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thus says it's just to infect a traditional enterprise with silos by creating a true empowered agency layer. And there's a lot of excitement in the chat about this and all the answers given. Thank you so much. And so perhaps there could be another question. Nicolas, do you have a question that you wanted to raise, like to make sure that we have spoken about pluggability? And so offering you the floor.
Yeah, this isn't Holochain specific, but I stepped away for 15 minutes in the middle too, so I might have already spoken about this. But Judd was speaking about some intuitions that he has around electronic code. I'm just wondering if you all could talk about pluggability and how that kind of comes out of Holochain and plans for how Scepter will develop with those pluggable protocols.
Yeah. So one of the parts of Scepter that we built already in C in our previous iteration of building Scepter is the self-describing protocols and a universal protocol parser, basically a universal protocol engine that works a little bit like regular expressions by having structured things in semantic trees. And it's a semantic tree regular expression language, because when you keep things structured as semantic trees, you don't have to lex the components because the semantics is already identified. You don't have to parse the components because the tree structure is already there. It just becomes a function of being able to do the matching inside of that. And it ends up being a highly interoperable fabric for being able to have things interact with each other. It's our intention to port over a lot of those functions that we've already built into a new Go-based one that is going to be an engine for interoperability between holochains, so that you can do translation between those contexts. We haven't done that yet. We haven't ported that yet, but it's, for us, one of the really beautiful things about the composability is being able to have this kind of framework that can essentially make have an API for APIs, or have a universal interoperability engine.
Yeah, so this goes back to the composability, the parts that are necessary for the kind of composability, going back to the natural inspiration, like building from nature. And I think that this one goes really deep. It's one of the necessary components to do the scaling up to the very large level. It's not necessary to get Holochain running and have it be really interesting, but to have the kind of interoperability and composability, we do need to bring that in. And but it's a little bit more complicated, and it's harder to tell the story about it. So that's why it's a separate part. But again, just the motivation for that has to do with composable abstractions and creating the correct composability for being able to scale up the way we want to scale up. And it's way cool. It's fun for geeky people.
For geeky people. So I want to bring a closure. So please, people, if you want to ask questions via our Facebook page, or there's also our Twitter. And is there other places you can join our Slack and ask questions over there? I think the links were posted in the chat. And perhaps there's something that we didn't address, Art and Eric, that you would want to speak about, something that hasn't been said, and then bring the conversation into closure, please.
I feel pretty complete. I'm grateful to you, Fair, for creating the space for this and holding the container, and grateful to all of you who are showing up and asking questions and being part of this. I think it's pretty exciting. There's some really interesting things happening here. And if it doesn't happen with our project, it sort of, I believe, has to happen structurally with some other project. So it's great. It's an exciting time to be part of all this stuff.
I actually want to say that we're still figuring out how to talk about this stuff, even though we've had the designs for it and we've built portions of it and that kind of stuff. We're not necessarily good about communicating about it with everyone. And depending on the audience, depending on sort of the prejudices that somebody brings into the conversation, like sometimes somebody who's experienced with blockchain has a lot more difficulty understanding these kinds of fundamental shifts in the paradigm or in the architecture than people who don't. And like we spoke with somebody yesterday, a cryptographer from Rensselaer Polytechnic, and it took us, it was bumpy in this first sort of 10 minutes of the conversation. And then we sort of figured out some of each other's jargon, and then we crossed this threshold where he was like, "Oh yeah, of course, that's exactly how you'd need to solve this problem." But for a while there was kind of like a complete disconnect. And so I want to
just for the record, what he said is, "Oh, you're doing a permissioned ledger with asynchronous broadcast." Right? So in his language, that's what we were doing. The DHT is a kind of ledger in his world, and our gossip protocol was asynchronous broadcast, and the validation rules was the permissioned part of the ledger. So once we figured out we were actually talking the same way in an abstract form, it was like, yeah, okay, this works. So that was kind of exciting to us too, because we've been coming at this from a development, and he's in this academic world of writing papers about this stuff. So it felt good.
So the reason I'm bringing this up is we need feedback, and we need other voices. We need like you sort of telling your version of it. You might be able to talk about it better than us if you, because we in some ways we know too much about it, and we're carrying all of our biases into the conversation, and it's hard to not jump deep into the weeds sometimes. And so in any case, I'm inviting like participation, feedback, blogs, jumping into our wikis, our Slack, and trying to also figure out how to talk about this in a way that makes it visible, sort of the distinct opportunities and problem space that comes out of Holochain, distinct from blockchain.
Twinkle fingers.
Yes, twinkle fingers. I want to finish the conversation or end the conversation by saying thank you, and deep gratitude for everyone that had invested these 2 hours in being with us. It's a huge, huge gift to everyone. And as it's been said and present, this is an exciting times that we're living in. We are all invited to become architects of the new world. And as we go into deeper understanding of what the different people are bringing forward and the pieces and how to talk about it, and the maps and the languages, then we will be better designers together. So there's problems, of access because of language. So we're all in this new story, in this new narrative, and we're looking forward to more of your comments, your questions. We're gonna also have next week a conversation about with Noah Thorpe and Harlan Wood. I think it maybe not Noah, but Harlan, about trusted networks and what is that they're designing with them. With Holochain. So thank you very much. And the recording will be available, and we hope to see you very, very soon, and that all your projects might blossom. We all need you. So thank you very much. And we're complete.
Great to see you, Michael.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Art. Thank you, Fernanda.
Pleasure.
Yeah, that was a very, very good production. Thank you guys very much. When did this Holochain come up? I haven't heard Holochain before.
We started development in December.
Mm-hmm.
And the term came in like August. Was it like August is when we started using that term? And the big breakthrough for us was splitting our project into the separate parts. So
Holochain was really just the data synchronization engine for multi-instance receptors in Scepter.
Yeah.
But being able to break it out into its own project so that it can be identified as what it's doing in sort of distributed systems is...
One thing that what happened to us is like we finally figured out how to encapsulate the different parts where people didn't have to understand the whole elephant, which is Scepter. And once we did that, then people actually seem to want to know what the whole elephant is, which is kind of fun. But yeah. So that's the timing on that.